A stranger gave me everything I wanted. Yesterday, he told me what he wants. There's 3 rules you learn too late. Rule 1. Desperate people make deals they don't understand. Rule 2. Perfect gifts always have invisible prices. Rule 3. When someone says they want nothing in return, they're lying about the timing, not the cost. I learned all 3 rules yesterday when the man in the gray suit knocked on my door at exactly 3:33 p.m. and told me what he wanted after 7 years of silence. But I should start at the beginning, back when I thought finding $50,000 in unmarked bills on my kitchen table was the universe finally cutting me a break instead of the first payment on a debt I didn't know I was accumulating. It was 2017, and I'd just been diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma while working a job that barely covered rent, let alone chemotherapy that cost $8,000 per round. My girlfriend Bianca had left 2 weeks earlier after I told her about the cancer, taking our dog and half my furniture, and leaving a note that said she couldn't watch me die. My brother Holden wouldn't return my calls because I'd borrowed money from him 3 times already and never paid it back. I was 31 years old and facing either bankruptcy or death, probably both, when I came home from my first chemo session to find my apartment door unlocked and stacks of $100 bills arranged in neat rows across my kitchen table. No note, no explanation. Just $50,000 in cash sitting there like someone had forgotten it, except the bills were pristine and sequential and obviously placed there deliberately. I should have called the police immediately. That's what normal people do when they find mysterious money in their locked apartment. But I wasn't normal people anymore. I was dying people. The kind who calculate how many months of treatment 50 grand could buy and decide that questions about origins are less important than not dying at 31. So I took the money to the bank in a duffel bag and deposited it in increments small enough not to trigger federal reporting requirements, a technique I'd learned from a documentary about money laundering. The bank teller looked at me suspiciously when I made the 3rd deposit of $9,000 in as many weeks, but she processed it without asking questions. I used the money for chemotherapy and rent and buying back some furniture so my apartment didn't look like I'd been robbed, which technically, I guess I had been, except in reverse. The cancer went into remission after 9 months of treatment I never could have afforded without that mysterious cash. My oncologist, Dr. Saffron, kept talking about how lucky I was to have caught it early enough and had good insurance, except I didn't have good insurance at all, just a stranger's money that had appeared exactly when I needed it most. I waited for police to show up with questions about laundered drug money or stolen cash. I waited for someone to demand the money back with interest and threats, but nobody came. The money stayed deposited and legitimate, and gradually I convinced myself it had been some kind of accounting error by the bank, that somehow 50 grand had glitched into my life through bureaucratic confusion that benefited me. Stupid, I know, but dying makes you want to believe in miracles. 2 years after remission, I was working as an assistant manager at a sporting goods store when the woman in the red dress came in looking for hiking boots. She was probably mid-50s with silver hair cut short and eyes that looked like they'd seen things they couldn't forget. She spent 40 minutes trying on different boots while I brought out boxes and made small talk, until finally she leaned close and whispered that my student loans from college had been paid off in full and I should check my account. I thought she was crazy and told her I didn't have student loans anymore, which was technically true because I'd defaulted on them years ago and destroyed my credit. She smiled like I'd said something funny and left without buying anything. And when I checked my email during lunch break, there was a notification from the Department of Education saying my $37,000 in defaulted loans had been satisfied by a third-party payment and my credit score had been restored. I tried to find the woman in the red dress by checking security footage, but the cameras had somehow stopped recording during the exact 40 minutes she'd been in the store. My manager showed me the gap in the footage and said it was a technical glitch, but the timestamp showed a perfect blank space surrounding her visit with precision that didn't feel accidental. I called the Department of Education 3 times trying to find out who'd paid my loans, but they said the payment had come through an anonymous third-party trust, and they couldn't disclose information even to me. My credit score jumped 200 points overnight. Companies started sending me pre-approved credit cards. I could suddenly rent better apartments and get approved for car loans. Someone had purchased my financial freedom with money I never asked for and couldn't return. That same week, my landlord called to say my rent was being reduced by 30% because a housing subsidy program had randomly selected my unit for assistance. I checked with other tenants, and nobody else had been selected. Just me. Just the guy who'd mysteriously had his student loans paid off by a stranger in a red dress who didn't appear on security cameras. I started writing down everything unusual that happened, trying to find a pattern or identify who was helping me and why. The list grew quickly. My car needed $2,000 in transmission repairs, and the mechanic called to say someone had anonymously covered the bill. I got promoted at work despite being qualified for the position, and later my manager admitted she'd received a recommendation letter about me from someone she couldn't identify or remember meeting. My brother Holden called to apologize and offer me money, saying he'd felt guilty about abandoning me during cancer, though we'd barely spoken since my diagnosis ended. By 2021, I was making decent money and had moved into a better apartment when I met Delilah at a coffee shop. She was reading a book about theoretical physics and drinking tea without sugar, and when I asked her about the book, she explained quantum entanglement like she was describing what she'd had for breakfast. We dated for 6 months before she told me she'd just been offered her dream job at a particle physics research facility in New Mexico and would be moving in 3 weeks. I was devastated, but trying to be supportive when she called me crying 3 days later to say the job offer had been rescinded because their funding fell through. Then the next day, she called again, ecstatic, because the facility had just received emergency funding from an anonymous donor and her position was reinstated with a higher salary. We got married 4 months later in a small ceremony neither of us could really afford until my grandfather, who I'd met twice in my life, died and left me $25,000 in his will, despite having 13 other grandchildren he actually knew. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time I wanted something, some invisible force arranged circumstances to give it to me. When Delilah and I talked about buying a house, I received notice that I'd inherited partial ownership of a property from a distant relative I didn't know existed, and selling my share gave us exactly enough for a down payment. When I wanted to start my own business, a former customer from the sporting goods store contacted me to say she was an investor, looking to fund small businesses, and had I considered entrepreneurship. When Delilah wanted to adopt a dog, we found a purebred puppy abandoned in a box outside our house, with veterinary records showing all vaccinations current, and a note saying, "Free to good home." Everything I wished for materialized through chains of improbable coincidences that individually seemed normal but collectively felt orchestrated. My business, a specialty outdoor gear company, became profitable faster than made sense. Customers appeared through word of mouth I couldn't trace. Suppliers offered me deals they claimed were standard, but my competitors said were unprecedented. A business magazine featured my company in an article about successful small businesses, generating enough publicity to triple my revenue in 6 months. Delilah got promoted to senior researcher and published papers that earned her recognition in her field. We bought a bigger house. We planned for children. I stopped thinking about the mysterious $50,000 that had started everything and convinced myself I'd just been very lucky, that good things sometimes happen to people who'd survived bad things, that the universe occasionally balanced its books in your favor. I should have remembered Rule 1 about desperate people making deals they don't understand, except I'd never made a deal, just accepted gifts I couldn't refuse. Yesterday afternoon at 3:33 p.m., I was working in my home office when the doorbell rang. Delilah was at work and we weren't expecting packages, but I went to answer it anyway. The man standing on my porch wore a gray suit that looked expensive and old-fashioned simultaneously, like it had been tailored in the 1950s, but maintained perfectly. His face was difficult to focus on, not blurred exactly, but slippery, like my brain couldn't quite hold on to his features. He smiled with teeth too white and asked if I was me, using my full legal name, including my middle name that I never used and few people knew. When I confirmed, he said we needed to discuss payment for services rendered, and could he come inside to talk privately. Every instinct screamed to refuse him, but my body moved aside and let him enter like it had been waiting for this moment. He walked directly to my living room and sat in my favorite chair without asking, looking around at the house and furniture and life I'd built like he was inventorying his property. I asked who he was and what services he was talking about, trying to sound brave but hearing my voice shake. He said I could call him Sterling and that he'd been helping me for 7 years, that every lucky break and mysterious gift and improbable coincidence had been arranged by him through means I wouldn't understand even if he explained. I told him I never asked for help and didn't owe him anything, but he laughed softly and said accepting gifts created obligations whether I understood them or not, that I'd been accruing debt since the moment I deposited that first $50,000 instead of burning it or turning it over to police. Sterling explained that he'd been watching me since my cancer diagnosis, that he'd identified me as a candidate for his program through criteria he wouldn't detail. The program offered comprehensive life improvement to individuals in crisis in exchange for a single payment to be collected at a time of his choosing. I'd never agreed to join any program, but he said my actions had constituted acceptance of terms, that using the money and accepting the help and building a life on his foundation meant I'd signed a contract written in choices rather than words. He pulled out a tablet and showed me documentation of every gift, every lucky break, every coincidence over 7 years. The itemized list totaled $847,000 in direct financial assistance, plus immeasurable value from arranged opportunities and engineered good fortune. The interest rate was 0%, because he said financial interest was crude when dealing with human debt, but the principal was due now, in full, in the only currency he actually wanted. I asked what currency that was while my hands clenched the armrests of the chair where I sat. Sterling said he wanted 7 years, the exact amount of time he'd been improving my life, to be extracted from my future and added to his present. I didn't understand and told him so. He explained that time was the only resource that truly mattered, that money and health and success were just tools for buying more time, and he'd spent 7 years giving me better time than I would have had otherwise. Now he wanted those years back, not as lived experience but as pure duration. 7 years of my future lifespan transferred to him through means both metaphysical and contractually binding according to laws older than written language. When I said that was impossible, he showed me his driver's license issued in 1987, with a photo that looked identical to his current appearance, then a military ID from 1952, showing the same face, then a faded photograph from 1923, showing him standing next to a Model T. Sterling said he'd been collecting years for longer than I could comprehend, that every person he helped eventually paid the same price, and that I now had 24 hours to accept the terms or face alternative collection methods he promised I wouldn't prefer. I asked what alternative collection meant, and he described what would happen to Delilah, to my business, to my health, to every gift he'd given me over 7 years, all of it reversing simultaneously, like a video playing backward at high speed. The cancer would return instantly, aggressive and incurable. The money would reveal itself as stolen and trigger criminal investigations. The house would be discovered built on contaminated land that destroyed its value. Delilah's research would be proven fraudulent through planted evidence ending her career. Everything I'd built on his foundation would collapse within hours, and I'd be left worse than where I'd started because now I had so much more to lose. I told him to get out of my house and that I'd call the police. Sterling stood calmly and said that was my right, but the 24-hour countdown had started and involved no extensions for legal consultations or appeals to authorities who wouldn't believe me anyway. He walked to my door, turned back, and said most people chose to pay because 7 years in the future felt abstract compared to losing everything immediately, that human psychology favored deferred pain over present catastrophe. He told me to consider how much I valued the life he'd built for me versus 7 years I wouldn't miss until decades from now when most people were declining anyway. Then he left, closing the door quietly behind him like he'd just delivered a package, rather than an ultimatum that made every moment of the last 7 years feel like borrowed time I'd been too stupid to question. I sat in that chair until Delilah came home at 6 p.m. and found me still sitting there, staring at nothing. She asked what was wrong and I tried to explain, the words tumbling out about Sterling and the money and 7 years of arranged good fortune that had all been building toward this moment. Delilah listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to something I couldn't identify. When I finished, she was silent for a long minute before asking if I'd started taking any new medications or supplements that might cause hallucinations. I showed her the documentation on Sterling's tablet that he'd left on the coffee table, except the tablet was gone and I had no proof it had ever existed. Delilah suggested gently that I should call Dr. Saffron about possible cancer recurrence affecting my brain, that paranoid delusions sometimes indicated neurological problems. I spent that night searching for any trace of Sterling online and finding nothing. No social media, no business records, no evidence he existed outside my memory, and the gifts I couldn't explain any other way. Delilah slept beside me while I lay awake, calculating what 7 years meant, whether I'd even noticed them missing from age 68 to 75, whether dying at 68 was a reasonable price for the life I'd lived since 31. By 3 a.m. I'd convinced myself Sterling had been a hallucination, that the stress of success had triggered some psychological break that manifested as a debt collector for good fortune. I finally fell asleep around 4 a.m. and dreamed about signing contracts in invisible ink that became visible only when you tried to run away. I woke at 8 a.m. to my phone ringing with a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice said she was calling from the IRS regarding irregularities in my business finances, and I needed to come to their office immediately with all records from the past 7 years. My stomach dropped. I called my accountant, who said she'd just been contacted by the IRS, asking detailed questions about the angel investor who'd funded my business startup, except she had no records of any angel investor because I'd told her I funded everything through personal savings. I checked my business bank account and saw a pending investigation freeze on all funds. Delilah called minutes later, crying, saying her research facility had suspended her pending an ethics investigation about falsified data in her published papers, accusations that made no sense because she'd never falsified anything. Sterling had started his alternative collection. I called the number on the business card he'd left, which I'd thought didn't exist until I found it in my pocket despite checking that pocket repeatedly the night before. He answered on the first ring and asked if I was ready to accept terms. I said I'd pay whatever he wanted if he'd stop destroying my life. Just tell me how the transfer worked. Sterling said to meet him at the same coffee shop where I'd met Delilah, that the location had symbolic significance he found aesthetically pleasing. I drove there at 10 a.m., running 2 red lights and ignoring speed limits, because every minute felt like another brick being removed from the foundation of everything I'd built. Sterling sat at a corner table drinking tea that smelled like flowers and copper. I sat across from him and said I agreed to his terms. Just stop ruining my life and take what he wanted. He smiled and said the ruination would cease immediately once the contract was executed, that he took no pleasure in destruction, only in collection. He pulled out a piece of paper that looked old enough to crumble, covered in text that hurt to read directly, like the words shifted when I focused on them. Sterling said I needed to sign using my blood because symbolic gestures mattered in transactions this old, and handed me a silver needle that looked more like a medical implement than a weapon. I pricked my finger and signed my name in blood that dried instantly into the paper like it had been absorbed rather than just stained. The moment my signature was complete, I felt something like a thread being pulled from my chest, an invisible extraction of something essential. Sterling folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, then said the 7 years had been collected from my future and added to his present, that I would die exactly 7 years earlier than I would have otherwise, but wouldn't remember this conversation once I left the coffee shop. Everything would return to normal, all investigations would disappear, my life would continue as if Sterling had never existed, except for a vague sense of unease I'd probably attribute to stress. He thanked me for my time and stood to leave, but I grabbed his arm and asked why he was doing this, what he did with all these collected years. Sterling looked at me with something almost like pity, and said that the universe was inefficient, distributing time equally to people who'd waste it, while others who'd use it well died too young. He'd found a way to correct that inefficiency by identifying people at their lowest points, improving their lives temporarily, then collecting payment when they'd be most willing to pay. The people he helped got to experience prosperity they'd never have achieved otherwise, even if that prosperity ended 7 years earlier than expected. He provided good years in exchange for unknown years, a trade most people accepted when framed correctly. I asked how many people he'd collected from, and he said he'd been doing this since 1894 and had acquired approximately 200 years so far, each collection making him younger, while his donors aged toward deaths they'd never see coming. I asked what happened to me now, whether I'd remember any of this or live in ignorance until I dropped dead at 68 for no apparent reason. Sterling said most donors forgot within minutes of leaving, that remembering would make the remaining years agonizing with knowledge of their expiration date. But occasionally, someone fought the forgetting, held onto the memory through sheer will or spite, and lived their shortened life with clarity about its cost. Those people usually made different choices with their remaining time, choices he found more interesting to observe, even though they couldn't change the outcome. He said I seemed like the type who'd remember, that my personality profile suggested I'd cling to this conversation like evidence of a crime I couldn't prove, and he wished me luck with the burden. Then Sterling did something with his hand, a gesture I couldn't track, and suddenly I was sitting alone at the table with no memory of how I'd gotten there or why. My phone showed it was 10:45 a.m. I had a vague sense of having forgotten something important, an appointment or conversation that had dissolved the moment it ended. I drove home in confusion, finding Delilah there on a weekday, which seemed wrong until she explained her research facility had given everyone the day off for equipment maintenance. She asked why I looked so stressed, and I said I didn't know, that I felt like I'd forgotten something crucial, but couldn't remember what. She laughed and said that was just getting older, that we were both in our late 30s now and memory issues were normal. I agreed, and tried to push away the persistent feeling that someone had stolen something from me while I wasn't paying attention. The IRS investigation disappeared without explanation, my accountant calling to say they'd closed the case citing administrative error. Delilah's suspension was lifted with apologies about a miscommunication regarding research protocols. Everything returned to normal except for the lingering sensation that normal was somehow wrong, that I was living in a house built on sand that would collapse without warning. I started having nightmares about gray suits and invisible contracts, waking at 3:33 a.m. repeatedly with my heart racing. Delilah suggested I see a therapist about anxiety, but therapy didn't touch the certainty that I'd made a terrible deal I couldn't remember making. Months passed. I became obsessed with time, calculating how many years I had left according to actuarial tables, trying to figure out if my anxiety about early death was prescient or just paranoid. I started writing everything down in journals, documentation of my days like I was creating evidence for an investigation I couldn't articulate. Delilah grew concerned about my fixation on mortality and aging, suggesting that surviving cancer had traumatized me more than I'd processed. She was probably right, except the trauma felt current rather than historical, like I was still sick but couldn't locate the illness. I researched people who'd died young from unexplained causes, searching for patterns that might indicate other donors like me, people who'd traded future years for present prosperity and then forgotten the bargain. I found stories that felt familiar. A man who'd been homeless at 30, became wealthy by 40, then died of sudden cardiac arrest at 55 despite perfect health. A woman who'd been dying of kidney disease at 25, received a mysterious transplant that saved her life, then died at 49 in her sleep with no medical explanation. A pattern of people whose lives had dramatically improved during crisis periods, who'd prospered for years, then died earlier than statistics predicted from causes that confused their doctors. I tried to contact surviving families, asking about mysterious benefactors or unusual circumstances surrounding the improvements in their deceased relatives' fortunes. Most thought I was a scam artist or mentally ill. One woman listened to my entire explanation before saying her husband had mentioned a man in a gray suit once, years before his death, but couldn't remember the context and thought it was a dream. That conversation sent me back to the coffee shop where I'd met Delilah, trying to recreate whatever had happened there that I couldn't remember. I sat in the same corner booth drinking tea and waiting for recognition that wouldn't come. The barista asked if I was okay, and I said I'd forgotten something important and was trying to remember it through location association. She said she saw that happen a lot, people returning to places hoping to trigger memories, but it rarely worked because memory wasn't that simple. I asked if she'd ever seen a man in a gray suit drinking tea in this corner, and she said lots of people wore gray suits. Could I be more specific? I couldn't, because every detail about Sterling had already faded, except the feeling of having met him. 2 years after the coffee shop awakening, I couldn't remember. I was at a business conference when I saw him. Sterling, unchanged, sitting in the hotel bar talking to a younger woman who looked desperate and grateful simultaneously. I watched him hand her a business card, watched her pocket it like she was accepting a gift instead of a contract, watched her leave with an expression that mixed hope with confusion. I approached Sterling immediately, demanding to know what he'd done to me 2 years ago, why I couldn't remember our conversation, but couldn't forget the feeling of having lost something. He looked at me with mild surprise and said I must have him confused with someone else, that he didn't know me. But his eyes said otherwise, amused recognition of someone fighting the forgetting he'd engineered. I sat down uninvited and told him I remembered signing something in blood, remembered 7 years being taken, remembered his explanation about collecting time from desperate people. Sterling's expression shifted from mild to interested, studying me like I was an unexpected result in an experiment. He asked how much I remembered exactly, and I described what I could, which was more sensation than detail, more certainty than specifics. He said I was remarkable, that in 130 years, only 7 people had fought past the forgetting enough to retain meaningful fragments, and all 7 had made similar choices with their remaining time. I asked what choices, and he said they'd stopped living for the future and started living for the present, understanding that their time was limited in ways other people only pretended to accept. I asked Sterling to give back the 7 years he'd stolen, that I hadn't consented to the deal in any meaningful way, and wanted my full lifespan restored. He said consent was complicated when dealing with people in crisis, that my acceptance of his gifts had constituted agreement regardless of my awareness, that the contract was bound by older laws than modern concepts of informed consent. The 7 years were already integrated into his lifespan, distributed across his extended existence, impossible to extract and return. I could no more reclaim them than someone could unspend money that had been dispersed through thousands of transactions. The best I could hope for was living well with the years I had left, which was still more than many people got, and better quality than I'd have had without his intervention. I asked him why he was helping the woman at the bar, what crisis had made her eligible for his program. Sterling said that wasn't my concern, that each donor's story was private between them and him, but he offered me a choice since I'd proven interesting enough to remember. I could help him find other candidates in exchange for information about my contract specifics, become a recruiter of sorts who'd receive compensation in the form of additional years collected from others. Or I could walk away and live my shortened life without further involvement, accepting that some knowledge was incomplete and some debts couldn't be negotiated. I told him to fuck himself and his offer, that I wasn't recruiting victims for a predator who dressed exploitation as help. Sterling said that was my prerogative and wished me well with my remaining 4 years and 8 months, a specific timeline that made my blood freeze. I spent weeks after that encounter trying to find others who remembered their deals with Sterling, posting in online forums about mysterious benefactors and unexplained good fortune. Most responses were spam or people trying to sell me conspiracy theories, but 3 respondents had stories that matched the pattern. A man named Cyrus, who'd been saved from bankruptcy at 40 and was now 51, calculating he had months left, based on a similar confrontation where Sterling had revealed his timeline. A woman named Willa, who'd survived a car accident that should have killed her at 28, had prospered for 9 years, and was now trying to document everything before she died at 46. A non-binary person named River, who'd escaped an abusive situation at 19 with Sterling's help, and was now 25, terrified of dying at 26, with so much life unlived. We formed a support group, the 4 of us and eventually 6 others, who'd fought the forgetting enough to piece together what had happened to them. We shared timelines and tried to find loopholes in contracts we couldn't remember signing, documents we'd never received, proof that wouldn't hold up in any court because Sterling existed in legal gray areas beyond normal jurisdiction. Cyrus suggested we could kill Sterling, that ending him might break the contracts, but none of us actually believed that would work, and all of us feared what would happen if we tried and failed. Willa wanted to go public with our stories, warning others about accepting mysterious help, but River pointed out that desperate people would still accept gifts, even knowing the price because immediate survival overrode future consequences. I stopped attending the support group after Cyrus died 3 months after the timeline Sterling had given him. Sudden stroke, no warning, dead at 51 exactly when predicted. The funeral was small, and his widow asked me how I'd known her husband, and I lied and said we'd met at a business conference years ago. She mentioned that Cyrus had been acting strange his final months, obsessed with time and death despite being healthy, and she'd thought it was early onset dementia. I didn't correct her. What would I say? Your husband traded years for prosperity and the bill came due? She'd think I was insane. And maybe I was. Maybe this whole thing was elaborate delusion born from cancer and stress and the human need to find patterns in randomness. But Willa died 6 months later at exactly 46, and River died 3 months after that at exactly 26, both of them on the specific timelines Sterling had predicted. I stopped looking for solutions and started living differently, doing things I'd postponed because they weren't practical or profitable. I took Delilah to Italy for a month despite the business impact. I learned to paint despite having no talent. I called Holden and apologized for borrowing money I'd never repaid, explaining I'd been desperate and grateful and sorry. He said he'd forgiven me years ago, and why was I bringing it up now? And I said I wanted to make sure everything was clear between us before I ran out of time. He laughed awkwardly and asked if I was sick again, and I said something like that. Yeah. Delilah noticed the changes and asked what had happened to make me so different. I tried to explain about Sterling and the 7 years, showing her the documentation I'd kept, and the support group members who'd died on schedule. She listened seriously this time. No suggestions about hallucinations or medical issues, just quiet attention to the impossible story I was telling. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, before saying she believed something had happened, even if she didn't understand the mechanism, that my certainty and the dead people's timing were too specific to dismiss. She asked how much time I had left, and I said approximately 4 years based on Sterling's timeline, and she started crying in a way I'd never seen before, grief for a future that was shorter than she'd expected, but hadn't arrived yet. We sold the house and most of our possessions, keeping only what mattered for mobility and memory. Delilah took early retirement from her research facility, and we traveled, living in short-term rentals across different countries, making every day deliberate, instead of letting life happen through routine. I documented everything in journals that Delilah would have after I died, evidence of a life lived fully, even if abbreviated by a contract I'd forgotten signing. We met other travelers, and I told some of them about Sterling, warning them about deals that seemed too good, gifts that appeared during crisis. Most thought I was eccentric or spiritual. A few listened with recognition that suggested they'd met their own versions of Sterling, collectors of different resources using similar methods. 3 years after Sterling revealed my timeline, I was in a market in Thailand when I saw him again, talking to an elderly man who looked sick and desperate. I approached and told the man to refuse whatever Sterling was offering, that the help came with a price he'd regret paying even if he couldn't remember agreeing to it. The man looked confused, and Sterling looked amused, saying I was interfering with private business and should move along. I planted myself between them and told the man that Sterling collected years from people's lives, that accepting his help meant dying earlier than expected, that no gift was worth trading your unknown future. The man thanked me for my concern, but said he was dying already, and a few extra years now would mean more than many uncertain years later, and pushed past me to continue his conversation with Sterling. Sterling followed me after the man left with whatever deal they'd made. He said I was making his collections more difficult and needed to stop interfering. I asked what he'd do if I refused. Kill me early to protect his business? He said death wasn't his tool, that I'd die on schedule regardless of my behavior, but he could make my remaining time significantly worse through the same methods he'd used to make my life better. Everything I'd built could collapse again. Delilah's career could be destroyed retroactively. My remaining years could be poverty and suffering instead of travel and peace. I asked if he had any conscience at all about what he did to people, and he said conscience was a luxury afforded to people who'd never needed to extend their lives through desperate measures, that I couldn't understand the mathematics of his survival. I returned to the hotel and told Delilah what had happened, the encounter, and Sterling's threat to ruin our remaining time. She said we should stop traveling and hide, make ourselves invisible so Sterling couldn't find us to make good on his threats. But I realized hiding would mean living in fear, which was its own form of death, and we'd already lost too much time to waste what remained on paranoia. So we kept traveling, kept living deliberately, kept documenting everything in case someone else needed proof that Sterling existed and exploited desperate people. I started a blog about the experience, writing anonymously about deals with supernatural collectors and the true cost of miraculous help. A few readers contacted me with similar stories, enough to confirm I wasn't alone in this experience, even if the specifics varied. My final year arrived faster than years should move, each month telescoping into weeks that felt like days. Delilah suggested we go home for the end, that I should die surrounded by familiar things, but I wanted to keep moving until I couldn't anymore. We were in Scotland when the headaches started, sharp and localized in ways that suggested something specific was failing. I went to a doctor who ordered scans and found nothing wrong, which made the headaches more concerning rather than less. 2 months before Sterling's predicted timeline, I collapsed during a hike, and Delilah called an ambulance. The hospital ran every test available and found nothing that explained the collapse or the ongoing symptoms that felt like systematic shutdown. Sterling visited me in the hospital room while Delilah was getting coffee. He sat in the visitor's chair and said my time was nearly complete, that he was there to observe the collection's final phase. I asked if he felt anything watching people die on schedules he'd engineered, and he said he felt satisfaction at the precision, that fulfilling contracts to the exact moment proved the system worked perfectly. He said most donors forgot entirely and died confused about their sudden decline, but I'd remember until the end, carrying knowledge that most people lived without. I asked what happened after collection, whether death ended my obligation or if something continued, and Sterling said he didn't know, that his interest ended when the years transferred, and whatever came after was beyond his expertise or concern. Delilah returned before I could respond, and Sterling was gone like he'd never been there, though the chair was still warm. She asked if I'd been sleeping, and I said I'd been visited by the person who'd arranged my premature death, which sounded insane out loud, but she accepted without question after 3 years of living with my timeline. We spent my final weeks in that hospital room doing everything we could do from a bed, watching movies, talking about memories, making plans for Delilah's life after I was gone. She wanted to continue documenting Sterling, warning others, maybe finding a way to break his contracts or expose him to authorities who'd believe. I told her it wouldn't work, that Sterling existed in spaces between laws and consciousness, but she could try if it helped her grieve. I died on the exact day Sterling predicted, 3:33 p.m. on a Thursday in April, surrounded by equipment that showed nothing specifically wrong beyond systematic organ failure. Delilah was holding my hand, and I used my last conscious words to tell her that the time I'd gotten was worth the price, that 7 fewer years of good life beat many more years of desperate suffering, that Sterling's deal had been fair even if the terms were hidden. She was crying, and said that wasn't true, but I meant it. I'd lived better because of Sterling's intervention, even knowing the cost. Maybe that made me complicit in my own exploitation, or maybe it just made me human. But here's the thing they don't tell you about deals with supernatural collectors. Death isn't always the end of consciousness. Sometimes you wake up somewhere else, somewhere that looks like the coffee shop where everything started, sitting across from Sterling, who's smiling like he's greeting an old friend. He said I'd completed my contract perfectly, and now had a choice to make. I could move on to whatever came next, released from all obligations and debt. Or I could stay and work for him, collecting years from other desperate people in exchange for extending my own existence indefinitely. The position paid well, and offered job security that transcended mortality, though it required comfort with exploitation and patience for watching people die on schedule. I asked what happened to most donors who reached this choice point, and Sterling said 90% chose to move on, accepting that their collection was complete, and whatever came next couldn't be worse than serving as a collector. But 10% stayed, recognizing that extended life through collection was still life, still experience, still time to exist in whatever form the job demanded. He said I'd remember my deal unlike most donors, which made me better qualified to help others, because I understood what they were accepting, even if they'd forget. I could frame the offer properly, explain the mathematics they'd forget, create better informed consent than he'd given me. I could be a kinder version of what he was, if I wanted. I told Sterling I'd need time to think about it, which made him laugh because time was the commodity we were discussing. He said I had forever to decide in this space between life and whatever came after, that the coffee shop existed outside normal time flow, and I could stay here thinking until I reached a conclusion. Most donors decided quickly, within subjective hours, but a few had been thinking for subjective decades without resolution. I asked what those long-thinking donors eventually chose, and he said they universally went mad from endless consideration, forgot what they were deciding, and had to be released to whatever came next, whether they'd chosen it or not. Consciousness required purpose and decision, and eternal deliberation dissolved both until nothing remained except static. So I'm sitting here in this coffee shop that isn't a coffee shop, in this space between life and whatever's next, trying to decide if extending my existence through exploiting desperate people is worth having existence at all. Sterling is at another table talking to someone new, a woman who just died and now faces the same choice I'm facing. I can see her confusion and fear and the calculations happening behind her eyes. Will she choose to move on, or stay and collect? Will she remember her own experience enough to do the job differently than Sterling? Or will decades of collection eventually turn her into another version of him, regardless of her intentions? I don't know how long I've been sitting here thinking. Subjective time is useless without external reference. Could be hours or years or decades. The decision feels impossible because both options carry forms of death. Moving on means ending whatever I am now, trusting that something better exists beyond the coffee shop, even though Sterling can't or won't confirm it. Staying means becoming a collector, living through others' lost years, watching people die on schedules I helped create. Neither option feels right, but choosing nothing means eventually dissolving into permanent static. I think I'm going to choose to move on, not because I believe something better waits, but because becoming Sterling isn't living. It's just avoiding death by outsourcing it to others. He built his extended life on 7,000 years collected from desperate people who trusted miracle gifts, and that foundation isn't solid enough to support the person I want to be even after death. Delilah would want me to choose the unknown over certain exploitation. The support group members who died on schedule would want me to break the cycle instead of continuing it. I want that too. Sterling is watching me now, knowing I've reached my decision before I announce it. He's already moving on to his next potential recruit, already arranging another desperate person's eventual collection. He'll continue regardless of my choice, but I can at least refuse to help him, refuse to become another tool in his collection system. That refusal is the only power I have left. If you're reading this somehow, if my consciousness managed to leave documentation in the real world instead of just this between space, remember that gifts from strangers always cost something, even if the price isn't disclosed up front. Rule 1. Desperate people make deals they don't understand. Rule 2. Perfect gifts always have invisible prices. Rule 3. When someone says they want nothing in return, they're lying about the timing, not the cost. Learn these rules before you meet your own version of Sterling, because I promise you, he's out there, and he's always looking for people desperate enough to accept help without asking questions. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.